The Utah Story Show is brought to you in part by Utah State, home of the Aggies. So living on campus means more sleep, more friends, and better grades because you are not commuting. While others are driving or walking on campus, you're getting those precious extra minutes of sleep. Instead of going home to your mom or your cat, you're hanging out with roommates, neighbors, and friends. So 84% of USU students live away from home, making on-campus housing a community of academic support, peer mentors, friends, and constant activities. For a virtual tour, room details, theme options, and to apply, visit usu.edu/housing. The Utah Stories program is brought to you in part by Curry Pizza. Curry Pizza is awesome. We've been having it at the office. They've been serving Indian food for over 10 years. They opened their first location in a small town called Bicknell. It's a tiny town in southern Utah. And they were serving curry on a pizza because they had to get curry and their whole idea of these sauces into the hands of these small town people. So he said, well, I'll make a pizza shop. And it's just an incredible place. It's owned by a guy named Binda, and he was recently featured on Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives, and he opened a second location in West Valley, Utah. I highly suggest you check it out. It's amazing pizza. The show's also brought to you by Paisley's Grass-Fed Beef. Premium all-natural grass-fed beef delivered right to your door, free anywhere in the state of Utah. It's an awesome new company, and we love their jerky and their steaks, and everything they do is awesome. Visit paisleys.com. That is PAIZLEES.com. Paisley's Grass-Fed Beef, always the right choice. The Utah Story Show is brought to you in part by Legends Pub and Grill. It's locally owned and operated and serving up all your classic favorites and unique originals too. They have amazing burgers, which I absolutely love. Their food is made with real, wholesome, delicious ingredients, awesome appetizers, main dishes like steaks, sandwiches, salads, pizzas, calzones, and now they've got a very special new options for gluten-free and vegetarian folks. Finish off your meal with mouth-watering desserts, plus they have a full bar which offers all sorts of local craft beers. I love their talented bartenders, their tasty creations, and check them out for an upcoming Utah Jazz game or U of U game. It gets rowdy in there, but it's an awesome environment to go check out a game. They recommend you call ahead and reserve space for your group, and they accommodate all ages. They now have 2 locations. Your downtown Salt Lake City location is at 677 South, 200 West, and their new Southtown location is at 10631 South, Holiday Park Drive in Sandy, Utah. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Utah Story Show. On the program today with me is Dr. Brian Moench. He is the head of the Utah Physicians for Clean Air. It's a nonprofit group that basically serves as advocates for clean air policy in Utah. And that conversation's coming up right away. Before that, we want to tell you about Curry Pizza. Curry Pizza has been serving Indian food for over 10 years. They opened their first location in a small town called Bicknell in southern Utah. That's when they began serving some of the incredible pizzas such as chicken tiki masala with all the fresh spices and ingredients, old world fresh Italian sausage and spicy sausage, as well as mango korma pizza. Guy Fieri from Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives recently learned about Curry Pizza and featured them on his show. Check out the episode, but more importantly, check out and try Curry Pizza. They have a location now in West Valley, and it is truly awesome. It's also brought to you by Paisley's Grass-Fed Beef. Premium all-natural grass-fed beef delivered right to your door, free anywhere in the state of Utah. Order yours today at paisleys.com. That's PAIZLEES.com. Paisley's grass-fed beef, always the right choice. All right. So, Dr. Moench, tell me a little bit about your background. How did you get into starting your nonprofit, and tell me what are your mission and goals with that group?
Our physicians group, and our name is Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment.
Oh, healthy environment.
And we actually picked that name specifically when we were first trying to organize ourselves into a nonprofit, because we figured even back at the date that we started organizing ourselves back in 2007, that along the way there would be issues about the environment that would transcend the air pollution problem. If we ever got the air pollution problem solved, there would be other environmental issues that we would want to address. So we kind of left ourselves open with that name, Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment, for a reason.
Makes sense.
But we started our organization in 2007, and what really precipitated it was one of our classic winter inversions in 2007 that went on for about 30 days. It really became oppressive. People were getting very depressed, and obviously very anxious to have some relief from it, but went on for a good solid 4 weeks. But what struck me while this was going on is that there really wasn't a lot of public dialogue about what kind of a public health hazard this really represented. It wasn't really addressed much in the media. Politicians weren't talking about it. And it struck me and some of my colleagues that the conversation about what kind of a public health hazard this really represents is not being had, and needs to be. So the first thing we understood is that we didn't really know all that much about it ourselves, because most physicians really aren't given a lot of training and expertise and background in what air pollution and what environmental contamination does to public health. So we decided we needed to be aware of the medical literature ourselves, and so we organized an ad hoc study group of about 8 physicians, and we poured over the medical literature for about 2 or 3 months. And then got back together, and we were basically shocked at what we had found, to the point where we called up Governor John Huntsman at the time and said, we need to talk. You need to understand what kind of a public health hazard this really represents. And he agreed to see us, and we spent an hour and a half with him. And after that session with him, he made air pollution one of the top 3 issues of his administration. So that's really what got us going, and we've been going at it basically gangbusters ever since.
Yeah. I think that a lot of people, this issue is very emotionally charged, because a lot of people, when there are red air days or there are extended inversions, they feel it in their lungs. They feel this inability to breathe properly. They get, like for me, example, I get bronchitis, I get asthma, and then I went up to the Capitol to complain about it, and I found out I was not alone. There was a lot of people there who had bronchial infections and all sorts of problems. So what is it in the air that's actually making us sick in those time periods?
Well, our air pollution is a witch's brew of 3 different components. The first, that perhaps most easily understood by the public, is particulate matter, which means little tiny particles of all kinds of stuff that's in the air that really shouldn't be. The second is gases, like carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxide, things like that. And the third is chemicals, and those chemicals are frequently attached to these particles. All 3 of those components of air pollution have their own health impacts. And there is some literature to suggest that, in fact, when you have high levels of ozone and high levels of particulate matter, which is actually kind of unusual, but you can have those kinds of circumstances, they actually have a synergistic effect, not just an additive effect, meaning there's a multiplicative impact on public health. So all 3 of those components are important. And the more we learn about it from the medical literature, the more we're actually becoming concerned about some of the chemicals that are attached to particulate matter. Mm-hmm. And we're learning more and more about the types of particles that are having health impacts, and what are the characteristics of those particles that have the most influence on public health. So it is very complicated from the standpoint of atmospheric chemistry, but there are 3 important components to this. There are particles, and there are gases, and then there are chemicals, mm-hmm. all of which can have an adverse effect on our health.
One of the things that I was shocked to learn when I did research on my first story about this was Magnesium Corporation. Magnesium is very important. We're one of the biggest producers in the world in MagCorp in the near the Great Salt Lake. But they were emitting somewhere around 11 million tons of chlorine gas until they put some better equipment on it. They did like a few $1 million upgrades. Now they're emitting 7.5 million pounds of chlorine gas. And then I looked up chlorine gas, and I was like, what is that? And I learned it was a banned substance in the Geneva Conventions when people were using it in World War I to basically just wipe out populations, and we're emitting 7.6
It was
million.
banned by the Geneva Convention.
Yeah, but it's in our air, and we're made to breathe it.
Well, Mag Corporation used to be considered the biggest polluter in the entire country until they were forced to clean up a large portion of what they do. I think it was probably about 15 years ago by the EPA.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean that they're a good citizen necessarily right now, but it's a lot less of an issue than it used to be. So we can at least take that degree of comfort, if there is any comfort in that.
Yeah, but do they say, okay, we went from 12, 13 million pounds of chlorine gas, we got it down to 7.8, almost decreased it in half. But I mean, what point is chlorine gas safe? Do they have science to say that, or?
Well, we don't get a lot of inquiries on chlorine gas because that isn't a big part of the overall contamination of the air shed on the Wasatch Front. But I think it leads to the conversation, or it should lead to the conversation of how much air pollution is safe in general, how much particulate matter, how much ozone.
And how do they even
how
know?
Much well, that's probably the main message of what probably is at least 5,000 or 6,000 medical studies published in the last 12 to 15 years. There is no such thing as a safe level of air pollution that people can be exposed to. Even very small amounts will have health impacts over a large population. And that sort of concept is mirrored by recent research on what smoking cigarettes does to a person. Try this on for size. Smoking one cigarette a day is half as much risk as smoking an entire pack.
Wow.
So what that tells you is that there is a relationship between air pollution, or excuse me, in this case cigarettes, but air pollution that follows the same sort of relationship. It is so exquisitely tight that very small increments have a significant impact on people's health. And then, oddly enough, it starts to taper off as the concentrations of pollution get higher. So there are a couple of morals to that story. If you might talk to a Utah legislator who hears that sort of information, they might say, well, when our air pollution is terrible, then it's really not doing a lot more damage than when it's actually pretty clean. Well, that's one way to look at it, but the way we would like people to look at it is all air pollution matters. Even very small amounts of air pollution matter. And when the air seems clean and we have a, quote, green day, and everybody feels upbeat about that, there's still enough air pollution in the atmosphere that there's an impact on public health. There's an impact on personal health. So our public policy should be steered towards this scientific axiom. All air pollution matters at any concentration, and we should do whatever we can, realistically, to eliminate as much as possible.
Yeah. And the focus of our October issue of Utah Stories is our housing boom. I mean, we have a lot of people coming into Utah from other states right now. We're now considered to be 53,000 housing units short of the actual demand of housing that exists in Salt Lake City. What's the short answer to how do we accommodate all this growth without sacrificing our quality of life along the Wasatch Front? Is there a good, smart way to be growing this valley and growing our population?
That is perhaps the question for the state of Utah in the next multiple decades. But let's be realistic about it. I don't see personally any way that Utah can have basically infinite population and economic growth without suffering significantly quality of life and air quality in particular. And there's obviously other limitations. We're not going to have the water supply to continue to increase the population at the rate we have been in the past, especially if people think that our future growth is more and more suburbia with more and more green lawns. That's just not going to be possible. So we first need to actually sit down and think about, can we actually have some sort of economic vision for this state where we just keep adding more and more people to the overall pot? I don't see any way that we can do that.
Well, if everybody got out of their cars tomorrow and took mass transit, would that have a huge impact on our air quality? Or
It'd certainly help significantly. But is that going to happen? Obviously not.
No, yeah.
But does that mean that that's the sort of public policy that we should be crafting so that we can, in fact, handle some of the pressure from ongoing economic and population growth? Obviously, it compels us to do that. But we're not really doing that to any significant degree. We're nibbling at the edges of our air pollution problem.
We're constantly widening our freeways. We're constantly trying to figure out how we can
We're not just widening our freeways, we're building more freeways. In fact, in many respects, we're looking at Los Angeles as the blueprint for what we should do in terms of expanding along the Wasatch Front. Whereas if you asked anybody from either end of the political spectrum, should we follow Los Angeles's example for growth? Everybody would say certainly not.
And why are we doing
Yet, in
it?
fact, that's pretty much exactly what we're doing.
Is it just nobody has this big picture look? It's just that people don't want to sit in traffic. A politician wants to solve a problem. That's a problem everybody wants to be vocal about, and that's just a higher priority than our air quality? Is that?
Well, there are a lot of reasons for that. It's our lifestyle has become ingrained and habitual. And if you think that people have become used to a lot of modern day conveniences, what are the consequences of saying now you got to get out of your car? Every time you want to go somewhere, you're going to have to take public transit. You're going to get immediate resistance from probably 80 to 90% of the population. And unfortunately, a lot of those people, almost by default, are going to be willing to sacrifice air quality so they can continue to use their car, and they'll put up with incredible traffic congestion to do that.
Yeah.
You try and travel on I-15 during rush hour, which probably runs from 7 o'clock until, I would say, almost 10 o'clock, and from 3 o'clock to 7 o'clock, it's a virtual parking lot.
Yeah.
And so right now, we haven't really provided people a lot of other alternatives, and they're willing to stay stuck in traffic, virtually going nowhere for hours on end to still have the convenience of their car. So a lot of that's habit.
Yeah,
But a lot of it also is poor public policy, not giving them alternatives.
Yeah. I saw a story in the Onion magazine, and the headline was 90% of the population polled supports transit for everyone else.
Exactly. That's exactly the problem.
Yeah. It's like, it's great for everybody else except for me because I like my car.
Well, there was a recent editorial in the Salt Lake Tribune that said it's time to make mass transit free.
Yeah, I saw that.
You know, if we're going to continue to pretend that the population of this valley can increase by 50% in the next 25, 30 years and not take significant measures like that, then we're really kidding ourselves.
So back to the question of why it is we continue to build freeways, expand freeways. Is it just the priorities? Is that just the main reason? Our policymakers just see the priority of vehicular travel as being much more important than our ability to be able to be healthy?
Well, it's a lack of vision, it's a lack of imagination, and it's a lot of bad habit.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're going to do anything in the way of improving that situation, we've got to take a serious look at all those things.
I actually met you about 3 years ago when you were giving a talk down at Guthrie Bicycle, and you had a full-on suit on, or a one-piece ski suit, it looked like, and a respirator mask, and you biked to the event, and it was the middle of winter, and you had a respirator, and I thought that was pretty hardcore. You actually practice what you preach.
Well, until some recent medical problems of my own
I heard about
that hit me about 6 or 7 weeks ago, I biked to work to and from probably 90% of the time, regardless of the time of year. So I did try and actually set an example. I thought it was good for me personally. I thought it was good for the community, and I would hope that people would say to themselves, hey, if this person can do it, I ought to be able to do it. And in fact, if we can get more people to obviously use alternative means of transportation, then obviously there's some hope. But we've got a long way to go.
Did you find that the respirator was good enough to be able to mitigate the effects of the poor air quality days?
Well, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. If you get a really tight-fitting mask that can filter out a lot of the particles, then you can certainly reduce the inhalation of some of those particles and reduce the impact on you personally, and that's important. One of the downsides, however, is that you have to get a tight enough fit in order to really be protective so you don't breathe around it, and therefore it's really hard to breathe around it, especially when you're going uphill.
Yeah, because you're taking in a lot of air.
If you're increasing the amount of breathing that you're doing with vigorous exercise, that tight-fitting mask really becomes a serious limitation.
Mm-hmm. So maybe that's quite difficult still at this point to consider as practical.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, it's there are an awful lot of people who, no matter what sort of apparatus you might give them to try and protect them, they're physically not going to be able to participate in that. So we've got to address this problem from every angle, trying to provide more bike lanes and safe bike lanes.
Yeah.
We need to provide separation from bicyclists from automobile traffic.
Yeah.
Far too many people have been severely injured and killed by encounters between bicycles and cars. And everybody recognizes that as kind of a serious risk. If you're going to be a serious bicyclist in an urban area, a lot of people think you're taking your life in your hands, and I certainly would be the first one to agree with them. So if we're going to solve this problem, one of the things we need to do is create safe interfaces between bicyclists and automobiles.
Yeah, I experienced that firsthand. I really love the Jordan River Parkway Trail.
Yeah.
And I had to go to West Valley to pick up my car, and I didn't want to Uber, so I decided to ride my bike. And I ride along the Jordan River Parkway, and then I'm trying to get off of it and get to the business I'm going to, and it's just not integrated at all with like Redwood Road and the rest of the area. Like, they're great bike lane, but as soon as you want to get off of it, you run into the road and you run into problems with no sidewalk, no accommodation of biking lanes that far west. Is that just one of the major problems? They're just not forward thinking enough to think beyond we'll have one single trail that goes north to south, but we're not going to really incorporate it with the rest of the areas.
Well, that's just another observation that we haven't paid anywhere near enough attention to making a realistic avenue for people to commute from wherever they live to wherever they work. Mm-hmm. I think we're making a few changes in the right direction, like what they've done with downtown recently, but we've got a long way to go. I personally know of an awful lot of people who at least tell me that if they felt like they could shield themselves from the risk of being hit by a car, they really would like to bike to and from work. Mm-hmm. And if you we're able to protect people that way, then obviously they'd run out of excuses. So we'd like to see what that might happen. But to this point, we haven't done anywhere near enough to protect people from that. So yeah, that's something that I think we could do. In fact, it wouldn't really require the legislature giving its blessing to us.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that we need to do that depend on the legislature, but that's one of them that we could really do without their help.
So what would you recommend people do? Write to their county council members or their community council and just say, let's accommodate bikers, let's help reduce pollution?
Yeah, they certainly go to local municipal entities like that. But here's one thing that bicyclists should be doing, and every time I drive on a busy road like 7th East, I kind of shudder when I see a bicyclist on 7th East. Bicyclists should in my view, go out of their way, even if it makes their trip longer, to avoid heavily trafficked areas. And when I commuted to and from my home to, say, LDS Hospital, which is about 13 miles, I would go out of my way, make my trip even a couple miles longer to make sure that I got as far away from traffic as I possibly could, not only for my own personal safety from the standpoint of trauma because of the potential accident with a car, but the air pollution that we all hate concentrates significantly along heavily trafficked corridors. There can be as much as a 30 times difference in the worst kind of particulate air pollution between right along a heavily trafficked road and as little as 300 yards away.
Wow.
So for people's own personal health preservation, if they're going to be bicycling to and from work or anywhere, they should be getting as far away from heavily trafficked roads as they possibly can. For both of those reasons.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So personally, what I went through was we moved to the UK for a while, and I was going back and forth between the UK and Salt Lake, and I got into running, and I'd run 5-6 miles in the UK, and I got in this habit, and I was there for like 90 days, and then I came back to Salt Lake, and I really wanted to keep it up, and it was cold. It wasn't particularly a terrible air quality day, but I decided to go out running. And from one time running, I just got this bronchial infection, and it just sapped all my energy, and it would not go away for like a month. Do you know what in particular, what particulates in the air weaken the immune system to such a degree that we get infections like that from just breathing our air?
Well, you brought up the immune system. We haven't really, to this point, delved into any real detail what the medical research shows about the impact on health. But because you mentioned the immune system, a study was published just about 10 days ago showing that exposure of laboratory animals to a couple of chemicals that are oftentimes part of the overall mix of air pollution, in this case it was dioxins, and dioxins are a frequent component of industrial emissions, and they're a significant component of cigarette smoke and wood smoke. But laboratory animals exposed to the kinds of concentrations to dioxins that are common in our environment showed impaired immune systems that went on for 4 generations after the initial exposure, meaning that the dioxins were having an impact on the functioning of chromosomes and genes that were being passed on to progeny 4 generations later.
Jeez.
Now, that kind of multi-generation impact is seen not just with the immune system, but it's also seen with other major organ systems, with the heart and with the lungs. So that leads to the overall concept that the air pollution that we're inhaling now is actually passing on adverse health impacts to people that are not only not alive at this point, but won't be alive for several generations because of what it's doing to our chromosomes. Jeez. So, if you don't care about your own personal health enough to make a difference, do you care about the health of future generations? Do you care about children that you might yet father in the future, to grandchildren that aren't even born yet?
Yeah. And it seems like as time goes on, I think it was about 9 months ago. The study was released that breathing poor air quality was the equivalent to smoking a pack of cigarettes a day, something like that. If you're being constantly exposed to bad air, wasn't that study about 9 months ago? And it just keeps coming out that there's more serious ramifications to breathing terrible air as they do more and more studies.
Well, this one will just knock your socks off. And this was published about a month ago in one of the world's most well-respected medical journals. They looked at over 7,000 people and compared the air pollution that they were exposed to in multiple cities and found this striking relationship. Living for 10 years, being exposed to ozone at 3 parts per billion caused as much deterioration of lung function and lung tissue as smoking a pack a day for 29 years. Now, put 3 parts per billion of ozone in context. The EPA's, quote, acceptable limit of ozone is 70. So if your city has less than 70 parts per billion ozone, the EPA will say that's okay for public health. And yet we know that we've known for a long time that was way too lax a standard. But to show you just how lax, put that in the context of this study. Just 3 parts per billion
and we probably
for 10 years
along the Wasatch
causes
Front.
as much deterioration of lung function as smoking a pack a day for 29 years.
That's crazy.
So
so
again,
what do we have along the Wasatch Front?
Well,
more than 3 parts per billion.
I'm
right?
glad you asked that question. You'll be surprised. The annual average ozone in cities like Los Angeles and New York probably is around 24 to 26 in terms of an annual average. Now, that's different than the spikes they frequently have in the summer, which are quite a bit higher, but an annual average of ozone is about 24 to 26.
Wow.
You don't want to know what the annual average ozone of all the multiple stations we have in the state of Utah. It's about 43 to 45.
God, we should all just be smoking packs
Well,
cigarettes a day.
Well, no, we shouldn't be doing that, but and there are a lot of reasons for that. Ozone is not confined to just urban areas, and we're finding that out because of their climate impacts. Ozone is the product of a chemical reaction that is catalyzed in the atmosphere by heat. So as global warming accelerates, we're going to have more and more ozone formed globally. And the precursors of ozone, which are nitrogen oxides and VOCs, can actually be emitted hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from where the ozone actually forms. So what's being emitted in China can actually increase the ozone formation here in the western United States.
No kidding. Wow.
It's a global atmosphere. And ozone is becoming a global problem, and it is plaguing even rural areas where we haven't commonly thought have air pollution problems. But now we know, in fact, that they do.
Well, so by that standard, pretty much everybody is breathing way too much ozone all the time, right?
Yeah.
In every city.
Yeah. They're not only breathing too much ozone, they're breathing too much particulate matter, and they're breathing too much chemicals.
And it would be equivalent to them smoking a pack of cigarettes every day for 20
That shows you how
years.
powerful an insult this is. And the insult, the biological insult, has the common denominator of inflammation. The effect on the heart and the cardiovascular system, the effect on the brain, the effect on the lungs, the effect on pregnancy viability, and so forth. The common denominator of air pollution's effect on all of these different disease outcomes seems to be chronic inflammation, chronic and acute inflammation. And one of the messages is it doesn't take much exposure to trigger that inflammation. Yeah. And in fact, you can be more specific. Some of the particles that you're breathing in a January inversion can still be inside your body in April.
Jeez.
In fact, some of these particles may never leave. I'll give you a few. If you want a few more startling studies, try this. So researchers did a group of autopsies on people as young as 3 years old and as old as 90, and they found hundreds of millions of particles in people's brains per gram of brain tissue that came from air pollution. And some of the subjects were as young as 3 years old. And then they did other studies where they found anywhere from 2 billion to 22 billion air pollution particles embedded in people's heart muscle. And some of those subjects were infants.
Jeez.
So these particles actually get embedded inside our body, including our critical organs, including our brain, our heart, our blood vessels, our kidneys. And some of them may never leave.
And these particles are, if I understand right, the NOx and the VOx, the NOx and VOx, they are emitted from smokestacks in different chemical compounds, and they form as nitrous oxide. And
well, you get nitrogen oxide emitted from all kinds of fossil fuel combustion. You get that from furnaces, you get it from water heaters, you get it just about from any kind of fossil fuel combustion. Similarly, you get VOCs emitted.
Mm-hmm.
Now, VOCs and nitrogen oxides have their own health consequences, but they are the precursors also of ozone formation in the atmosphere after the fact.
Explain a precursor?
Well, it means that if the end product is ozone, it means the ingredients for ozone are nitrogen oxides and VOCs.
Okay.
Stir them up, add heat, and you get ozone.
Okay.
So now you have nitrogen oxides with their own impact, VOCs with their own impact, and now they formed a third compound that has its own impact.
And those are the chemicals you're talking about? They were
Those
finding in people's brains and heart muscles?
No. Those are the gases.
Okay,
Ozone is a gas.
Uh-huh.
3 molecules of oxygen. It's a very.
You're talking about the chemicals people.
It's a very powerful oxidizing agent. Now that's different than the particles. What I just mentioned in terms of the number of particles that the researchers found embedded in people's bodies, that's a whole different thing.
Particles are like the chlorine gases.
No, the particles are little tiny fragments of things like carbon, black carbon.
Okay.
Can be dust.
Like the PM 2.5?
Right. That's what PM 2.5 is a reference to particulate pollution, 2.5 microns in size and smaller. So they're extremely tiny particles, almost to the point where you can't see them. But in addition to those particles having their own toxicity, you can have chemicals attached to those particles which enhance the toxicity. So when these researchers found all these shocking concentrations of particles inside people's critical organs, they weren't also tracking the chemicals that could be attached to them. So
they were just tracking particles.
As shocking as those research papers were about what kind of exposure we have, they really didn't give us a full picture of the overall toxicity because they weren't measuring chemicals at the same time. And they weren't measuring gases.
Man. So
at autopsy, you don't have a chance to see what kind of carbon monoxide levels a person was exposed to, what kind of VOCs, because those are gases. They were just examining particles. So back to the early part of our conversation, of those 3 components of air pollution, they were just examining one.
So basically what they found is you can't detoxify all the particles that are entering your body. Those particles are staying in your body.
Some of them are.
A lot of them
you can get rid of some of them through various means, but some of them you're not going to get rid of.
So everybody's into detoxing these days. Do you know what are the most effective ways to detox if you feel like your immune system is weakening because of the air quality?
That's out of my area of expertise. And I would caution people to not really jump on board with a detox sort of program, because I think there's a lot of bogus medicine being practiced by people who are really not qualified and not experts in offering advice for people to, quote, detox.
Mm-hmm. What about mitigating the effects of inflammation? Are there some
Well,
really
no,
good
that's a little different.
anti-inflammatory?
That's a little different. Inflammation you might see as a balancing act between the formation of free radicals, meaning chemicals or compounds that have a couple of unpaired electrons. So you have free radicals, and then you have chemicals that can scavenge those free radicals, can stabilize those electrons, and those are antioxidants. So the amount of inflammation that a person might experience biologically inside, underneath their skin, is kind of a balancing act between the formation of free radicals and the amount of antioxidants that they consume. If you consume more antioxidants, then obviously you can put that balance more in your favor. Mm-hmm. And in fact, a study published just a week ago showed, in fact, that daily ingestion of aspirin can actually, the anti-inflammatory effect of aspirin can actually cut in half the amount of deterioration of lung function of chronic exposure to air pollution.
No kidding. Wow.
Now, I'm not saying everybody needs to go out and start taking aspirin, because there are obviously some consequences to that. It makes the blood more difficult to coagulate. But they need to start raising that question with their doctor to see if that's appropriate. And that's just one example of an anti-inflammatory agent. There are certainly things in foods that are heavy in antioxidants that people can consume. There was one study that showed that there's a particular antioxidant that is uniquely effective against the inflammation of air pollution found in grapefruit. And seeing how I don't see a lot of downside to grapefruit for most people, that's probably a reasonable thing to do.
I'll put that on my list.
Yeah.
I heard turmeric is really good.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of examples of antioxidants that people can consume in one form or another. I would say generally the studies would suggest that consumption of antioxidants as part of a regular diet is going to be a lot more effective than trying to take them as vitamins and supplements. Those don't seem to be anywhere near as effective. But there are some things that you can do to decrease the overall inflammatory impact of things like air pollution. And in this case, aspirin is certainly one of them. And then there are a lot of others, like dark chocolate.
Yeah. Okay.
Smear some dark chocolate on your face every time you go outside in a winter inversion. Take a bath in dark chocolate. No.
That works for me.
That might be an expensive
I have
bath.
Chocolate with my coffee every morning. I think that maybe counts.
Well, you can probably fool yourself into thinking that it counts, but there are actually some studies that suggest that in fact dark chocolate has a valuable role as an antioxidant. So it tastes good. Why not?
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of these things. So it's like the air pollution's probably going to get worse before it gets better. So the question is, how do we live with it? And obviously, when you have red air days, you're told don't go outside, don't breathe the air, stay out, don't exercise outside. Is there anything else that you would recommend to people?
Well, let me back up a step in the comment that you just made. Let's do everything we can to not make it worse.
Yeah,
and so
I would love to hope that our Utah State Legislature and governor would put the brakes on economic development being a higher priority than air quality. But you look at the inland port, for example.
Well, exactly. Let's bring up the inland port. That's a perfect example of the kind of economic development that we do not need. It is basically ushering in a new era of heavy industry and a lot more pollution.
And
now there are some industries that obviously have a low pollution footprint and a low carbon footprint.
Exactly.
Provide good paying jobs, and we certainly ought to encourage those kinds of companies to come here. The inland port is anything but. It's virtually the exact opposite. Mm-hmm. So this scheme, and I'll call it a scheme, by those powerful legislators that rammed this through a couple of years ago, they need to push the pause button and say, wait a minute, what really have we done here? We think it's exactly the wrong move for the economic future of the Salt Lake Valley. And we're already seeing almost everybody that was polled at a recent town hall meeting was basically shocked at the prospects of having another new significant source of air pollution on the Wasatch Front. And that's what this is. We're talking thousands of new diesel trucks in and out of the valley every year, every day. We're talking dozens of heavily loaded, fully loaded commodity trains with very polluting diesel engines. And then we're talking, I don't know how much more airplane traffic. Airplane traffic is a significant source of pollution. We're pouring, $2 billion into expanding the Salt Lake City airport. I never heard one single public official talk about the air pollution consequence of expanding the airport. And yet a study was done recently of LAX, the airport in Los Angeles, and the researchers calculated that the airport produces half as much pollution as all the cars on their freeways.
No kidding. I never even thought about that either, actually.
Right.
The airport expansion.
Nobody even commented on it. And they just plowed ahead with, expanding the airport. I don't know how many new runways and how many new plane trips in and out of the airport that they calculated this was going to bring. But I didn't hear anybody even mention in passing what kind of air pollution consequence that would have. Yet that would undoubtedly be another leg of the overall air pollution burden related to the inland port. Mm-hmm. So the inland port is the most significant new source of air pollution probably that this valley has seen in the last 50 years.
What about the argument, and I just had this argument with my brother, that we need the inland port. There needs to be another port, and it should be here near Salt Lake because there's...
Who's the we?
I don't know. I was like, why would we need to have more diesel trucks? Why would we need to have more of Salt Lake being more of a hub than it already is when we're in a bowl, especially when we're geographically disadvantaged for air pollution? We're all going to get more sick because of the geology of our valley.
Well, I would ask who's the we and what is the quote need?
Yeah.
Because it basically drags the Salt Lake Valley economy in the direction of heavy industry and a lot more pollution. Nobody wants that. No matter where you fall on the political spectrum, nobody is in favor of that.
Yeah.
So let's own up to the reality of what this would actually entail. It would entail an awful lot more pollution from multiple sources. And then all the, quote, jobs that people claim would be related to it, in the experience of other cities that have done this, these are very low-paying jobs. And in fact, a lot of the workers aren't paid enough to even stay off public assistance. And a lot of those, quote, jobs will eventually be eliminated by automation. So we don't see hardly any upside to this except for making a few special interests very wealthy.
Exactly. And so Salt Lake City, our mayor, Jackie Biskupski, finally worked with the city attorney to file a lawsuit against the state of Utah, I guess to, is it an injunction when it stops, when they wanted to stop the construction of the inland port? Do you know the progress of that?
Well, I'm not an expert on the details of the lawsuit, but the thrust of it is that it really focused on the taxing structure between the state, between the Port Authority and the city.
All the benefit.
Yeah,
the
sure.
city was going to get all of the pollution and trucks, and the state was going to get the tax. The tax.
But it was my understanding is, as far as the lawsuit goes, it wasn't a lawsuit about what it would do to air quality, what it would do to the Great Salt Lake, what it would do to the wetlands. It was basically on taxing authority. Now, we'd like to see it stopped any way we can get it stopped. But my understanding of the lawsuit is that's really not the thrust of the lawsuit. The lawsuit is mainly one of finances.
So it's
as legitimate as that is.
Is it then a done deal then?
Well, here's our contention. If we make it unpopular enough, we don't think it's a done deal. And in fact, the first public polls taken almost a year ago, and this would have been just 5 or 6 months after the whole thing was passed virtually in the middle of the night by the legislature. Even at that time, the public was opposed to it about 2-1. And that was before groups like ours started a real vigorous campaign to try and educate the public about what this would really bring to the Salt Lake Valley. So we think that if and when another poll is taken, that the overwhelming majority of the people in the Salt Lake Valley would be opposed to it. Now, assuming that that's not only the case now, but would be even more the case the longer this battle goes on, and the more we're able to educate people about what this would really bring to the valley, we think resounding, overwhelming public opposition to this will doom the whole idea.
That would be great.
Because businesses really don't want to be investing in a future for themselves in a project that's deeply unpopular with the public. Mm-hmm. If you're a business owner, do you want your name plastered all over something that the public hates? I don't think so.
Good point.
And in fact, tonight, there is a mayoral debate at the Salt Lake City Main Library between the two remaining candidates, all on environmental issues, and the inland port will be front and center on that debate. And the question we're going to ask those candidates is exactly that question. Do they see the strategy of making this port unpopular enough that businesses would be very reluctant to invest their money in that port, given the public's attitude about it? Mm-hmm. What they think about that strategy. I think it's a good strategy. When you look at the websites of other inland ports in other cities that have done this, one of the things that they have highlighted is in order to have a, quote, successful port, you have to have public buy-in. The public hasn't bought into this. Mm-hmm. Even at this early stage, the public is very much
in Salt Lake.
Yeah, there you go.
They open it up to
well,
public.
It's important to understand those people that are involved in that physical altercation. They're not the minority of people in this valley in terms of whether or not they want the port. Mm-hmm. They were just more willing to put their bodies on the line.
Yeah, and then the governor called them terrorists.
Yeah, right. I think all the evidence would suggest, in fact, that already the majority of the people don't want it. And our contention is if we continue to give them good reasons to oppose it, public opposition will solidify even further, and they really won't be able to force feed us this because businesses won't want to invest in it.
You mentioned that it's just a group of special interests that will greatly benefit by the inland port. Can you identify who those are?
Well, I'm not going to name specific individuals yet, but at some point we're actually going to have to do that with the public so people will know who stands to make millions of dollars from this. What companies?
The more I've studied the mayoral election process, the more I've understood just how much the moneyed interests and special interests play a huge role in determining who our next mayor is going to be. And I'm understanding, like, these politicians of ours, they're by and large just puppets for the people getting them elected. And they're realizing, I mean, we play in an arena where money really determines who gets the political power. How do you prevent that from happening? I mean, how do you stop all these special interests from basically ruining our quality of life as we grow in Utah?
You can make a very good argument that cynical assessment that you just recited aptly describes not only the government of the state of Utah, but virtually every other state in the union, as well as the federal government. Mm-hmm. And I'll join you in that cynical assessment. If you want to think we have a democracy, you have to acknowledge we have a very flawed democracy, deeply flawed democracy, including a couple of recent awful decisions by the Supreme Court that virtually canonize the influence of money in our elections, which is the opposite of democracy. Mm-hmm. So yes, moneyed interests have a profound effect on public policy here in the state of Utah and even in the city of Utah, even though we like to think of Salt Lake City as the liberal oasis of the state of Utah. Money talks everywhere.
Yeah.
And if the people are going to have their common interests protected, we are going to have to call out the moneyed interests that stand to benefit from public policies that don't further the interests of the public and do further and line the pockets of these special interests.
Yeah. And the first time I really got a sense for that, it's public information to just simply look up what big corporations donate the most to our local political leaders. And I found it interesting.
That doesn't tell the whole story, though.
No, you get half the story that way. You get just a piece of the puzzle. But
let me give you an example where that sort of issue, and I agree with you totally. Who is funding various politicians? You can look that up. But I'll give you an example. When we were battling the medical waste incinerator Stericycle in North Salt Lake, trying to get it to shut down because it's a serious health hazard to the people in North Salt Lake. We were basically told by people in the state government they didn't want it either, but if they yanked the permit of Stericycle would come in with 10 lawyers, and the state would come in with their one lawyer, and the end result would be Stericycle would spend enough money on lawyers to be able to wiggle out of just about anything that the state could enact in terms of forcing them into a better deal. Now, we're still able to get them to agree to move out of North Salt Lake, even despite that. Mm-hmm. But that's an illustration of the asymmetry of financial clout that has nothing to do with political contributions. It has to do with the legal system, actually.
They can just come in with their attorneys, and then our government leaders kowtow to what they demand. You and I both know that
outcomes of legal battles aren't necessarily, in fact, oftentimes not settled on matters of law, but settled on who has the most resources.
Yeah.
Who can throw more money at an outcome. And these people who have money can throw more money towards a legal system that will benefit them. So, yes, it's political contributions, but it also has an impact in other ways, like the legal system.
Yeah. Well, so when I did do the research to look at some of the biggest political campaign contributors, one of the biggest was Reagan advertising. So I decided, well, if you want to know who not to vote for, if you want to reduce light pollution or electronic billboards or distracting our view corridors with billboards, don't vote for the person on the billboards you see the most. And that's my recommendation if you want a good start for how to get special interests out of politics. But in terms of environmental issues, I'm sure Rio Tinto is also on the top of the list. England Trucking.
Rio Tinto owns a lot of the land that would be developed for an inland port.
Oh, do they?
Yeah. The Comino Group does as well.
Yeah. But you get half the picture by knowing who's giving the most money to our political leaders. They're not giving them that money to just be nice and friendly. Obviously, they have interests involved. And so I think the missing part of the puzzle is exactly what are the favors that they want. And the problem is not enough of us really know what are these special favors they're getting. What are they doing? Is there a better way that you know of to understand that?
Your critique is multifaceted. It's a public that either doesn't have enough time to invest in becoming informed or doesn't have the interest or feels disenfranchised to the point where their interest and their objection to the way things are run are pointless because the outcome's almost always preordained. There's all those kinds of things. But we certainly want to encourage people to become very interested, actively engaged in trying to solve these local issues as they possibly can, because if they don't, then they don't get solved in their favor.
Yeah.
They get solved in the favor of those special interests that we talked about. They don't get solved in the favor of the public's common interest.
Yeah, and if somebody's spending millions of dollars to see that their interests are being taken care of by our political leaders, if there is not a equal amount of public opposition against what it is they're trying to pass, then of course the moneyed interests are going to win. And so a big part of what we promote at Utah Stories is people cannot simply be apathetic if you don't want to have the quality of life just totally diminish here in Utah.
You don't really have a democracy unless you have an informed, actively engaged electorate.
Yeah.
And
you can't sit on the sidelines if you really want to have a democracy.
Your own personal interests will always be opposed by someone who has more money. And if you don't become actively engaged in defending your interests, you know who's going to win out.
Amen. Yeah. Yeah, we see it over and over again, and that's why we promote the ideas.
That's an underlying story in all the air pollution battles.
Yeah. And with, I mean, this is a big question we ask all the time here. With the newspaper coverage diminishing, with the local television stations having to cut costs and budgets, how do you see the big gap forming in the type of coverage that needs to happen? What do you think could fill that gap, or how do you see people being informed and getting informed? How does an average citizen really find out what's going on?
Well, I can't remember the exact quote, but was it Thomas Jefferson who said something to the effect, if he had to choose between, quote, democracy and a free press, he'd take a free press? Well, obviously that's a marriage that cannot survive one without the other. Mm-hmm. You don't have a democracy surviving without a free press. And because of the recent developments, and by recent I mean the last 10, 15 years, of things like the internet and the revolution of media and the consolidation of media corporations, it is becoming increasingly hard to find out, in fact, what's really going on. And then you add into the mix disinformation on the internet, outright lies and conspiracy theories that we know played a significant role in the outcome of the national 2016 election. For example, you have the influence of foreign countries like Russia and other foreign countries that are actively engaged in a disinformation campaign to try and steer the results of United States elections in their favor. The election of Donald Trump, obviously a significant role, regardless of whether or not you think Trump officially colluded with Russia or not. All the evidence is overwhelming that Russia's disinformation campaign, fake news campaign, conspiracy theory campaign played a significant role in steering people away from actual real information, truth, and facts. Mm-hmm. I don't think you can overstate the importance of investigative journalism nowadays. Compared to any other point in our history, it's more critical than ever.
Yeah, and I really think that people need to continue to subscribe to newspapers, support local journalism, do what you can.
It's tragic to see that the Salt Lake Tribune now every morning is about 6 pages long, and half of that is sports.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they have 4 sports writers, and I think they have 1 environmental writer still.
Right, and what a sad commentary that is on our society. But they're just trying to survive. I don't fault them.
No, it's not them. It's what readers will support.
It's what readers will support, and it's also the end result of the unraveling of the journalistic institutions that we used to have. Mm-hmm. So yes, we need to support what few we've got left all the more. But I don't see any substitute for people becoming engaged themselves in trying to save these institutions.
Yeah.
These institutions aren't going to be saved on their own. The people are going to have to jump in and be their allies.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know, like, for example, the buy local movement is very strong. More and more people are seeing the value in supporting local farmers, local makers, local businesses. That movement is strong, but it's not coinciding with supporting our local journalistic institutions. It's not coinciding with the idea that we should pay more attention to what's going on in our backyard. And I mean, I try to always ask the question of why, but do you think it's just because there's now such a proliferation of attention-grabbing headlines and clickbait out there that consumes so much people's attention that they're just not going to pay attention to what's going on in their own backyard?
Well, I think the problem is multifaceted. It's so easy to get on your computer, get on the internet, and you're immediately inundated with all kinds of news, most of it useless, most of it trivia. It just irks me to death to open up Yahoo News, for example. And every single day I can count on one of their main stories being how much Kim Kardashian is not wearing that day.
Yeah.
And if you were to compare the number of stories on Kim Kardashian to the climate crisis, which is tantamount to the greatest threat to human civilization ever.
Yeah.
And we're headed towards the demise of modern civilization because of it. If you were to try and weigh the number of stories of Kim Kardashian versus the climate crisis, she'd probably win 10-1.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know what I also find interesting? I get on the Tribune's website, I'm reading an interesting story, I scroll to the bottom, and I watched a lot of sitcoms as a kid. Willis from Different Strokes, what does he look like today? That's a clickbait headline at the bottom of the story for
Sure.
the Tribune story about
Yeah.
like air quality.
Right.
They're basically shooting themselves in the foot by promoting that kind of story
Sure.
at the bottom of a great journalistic story,
Yeah.
investigative piece, something like that. And I'm
Yeah.
like, come on.
Well,
Of course I click. I want to know what Willis looks like today.
Well, sure. I mean, it shows how desperate they are to survive.
Yeah. I'm sure they get paid quite a
But
bit
it
of
creates a
money to have
vicious cycle. They throw out that kind of clickbait, and so people respond to it. So then they have to do more of it, and then people respond to more of it.
and then they're going to get paid more by that advertiser.
Right.
And they know that they're going to distract somebody from something that might actually be important going on in their local community. They're going to move their attention over to this thing that is interesting that they want to find out. And it's just like, I feel like everybody's attention span is shrinking. And
Oh, let me give you a study on people's attention span
Yeah.
shrinking.
let's hear it.
A bunch of researchers found through some studies about 12 years ago that the average adult had an attention span of about 15 seconds. In other words, how much they would focus on something before they got distracted. They repeated that kind of a study, same kind of methodology, a year or so ago, after basically the onslaught of the internet and social media and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. And they found that the attention span of adults had plummeted from 15 seconds down to 8 seconds.
Oh, man.
And guess who has an attention span now greater than a human being, an adult human being?
A fly?
A goldfish. With 9 seconds. You can
Really?
get the attention of a goldfish for 9 seconds before they'll lose
You
interest.
got to send me a link to that study. Gosh, that's just...
Human beings have 1 second less attention span now than a goldfish.
Yeah, that's crazy. And it's like what I find is the average reader time on a story we produce, and it takes more than 5 minutes to read our stories.
Sure.
The average time is going down, and it's down to about 1 minute and 30 seconds. I guess that's really good considering the average is 8 seconds. But it's like we still produce the magazine because we really believe that you need to spend between 5 and 10 minutes reading a story to really fully digest the information that's in there and to comprehend what's actually going on. And
I agree completely. I have a Facebook page that has about probably 1,100 followers, and I try and post something that I think is politically or scientifically germane to our current situation, or current events.
I follow you on that.
Maybe whenever I can get around to it, maybe as often as once a week, sometimes as infrequently as once a month. But anytime a thought comes to my head that I think, hey, people need to know this, or I need to share this with somebody. I can tell you there is a direct correlation between how long of a post that I make and the number of people that actually will read it.
Right.
And it's no surprise at all that if I can keep it to a couple of paragraphs, I might get 60 likes within a couple of hours. But if I post something that it's in more depth, that's 2 or 3 times that long, I'll get half that. But it speaks to what you just described, that people are not willing to engage themselves at length in issues that are complex, that can't be understood in 2 or 3 minutes.
But there's one caveat to that. What we're doing right now, this long format podcast, we saw this very slow uptick in growth.
Mm-hmm.
But last month we had a doubling of downloads, and our subscribers on YouTube increased significantly. You know about the Joe Rogan podcast?
I don't.
He is now the #1 most watched, listened to interviewer in all of world history, Joe Rogan. And he was host of Fear Factor on NBC.
Oh.
He had like bugs, and he's like, I thought he was just like this dumb meathead dude until I started listening to him. He interviews doctors and scientists and leading experts in all sorts of things related to anatomy and physiology and science. And he's just like a really great listener, great interviewer. And he has 4 million downloads of every single episode of his podcast. And it's just an amazing trend that's happening. It's showing that the attention span of humans can actually be his podcasts go 2 to 3 hours.
Well, I think that's great.
Yeah, it's just awesome.
And I have no scientific basis for making this sort of an assessment, but I'm just going to throw out there as a possible reason why. I think a lot of people in this day and age, in the era of social media, where we don't call each other on the phone anymore, we text to everybody. Mm-hmm. We type out stuff on Facebook and social media, and we don't interact with each other. We don't see each other down at the mall. Mm-hmm. Teenage kids don't have a mall to hang out.
Yeah, we don't have really a public square anymore.
We don't have a public square anymore, and maybe this podcast is, albeit a poor substitute, of human interaction, of actual human beings talking, emoting, offering opinions. It's less sterile than reading it, say, on a newspaper page.
Yeah.
Or reading it on the internet. So I hope the trend continues, and I congratulate you for what you're trying to do. And if that's what it takes to get the message out there, let's go for it.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. It's something we took on where we really didn't have the resources or time to really do it in a big way, but it's really encouraging to see that we're starting to get more and more downloads, and more people realize that if you want to know what's going on, you can't watch a 2.5-minute news story and you really understand what mayoral candidate to vote for, how to improve our air quality, or how to get involved locally. It's just like that format is not going to provide it.
Well, even less so. Say compared to television news. What if you watch the evening news on TV? In fact, one of the TV stations just called me up, and they want to interview me for one of their evening shows coming up in the next couple of days. But if you watch a typical evening news, local newscast, the adage, if it bleeds, it leads, rings true almost every single day. There are car crashes. Mm-hmm. There are teachers having sex with their students, disgusting things like that. Mm-hmm. That's going to get almost all the attention.
Yeah.
Very seldom on an evening news, which is still where most people get their information, by the way. Very seldom do you get a story of any real substance. And how could they? Because most of those stories last anywhere from 30 seconds to maybe a minute and a half at the most.
Because that airtime is so valuable. It's just like how much it costs them to have that bandwidth to produce the show, to have those advertisers come on. If they don't show significant ratings, then they're up a creek. They can't sell ads. And
then throw this into the mix. You're probably familiar with Sinclair Broadcasting Group.
Yeah.
That has bought up about 200 local TV stations in the country.
They own 2 of ours, I think.
They have a very hardcore right-wing political agenda, to the point where they have a national commentator basically giving a Trump cheerleading commentary around the news time every single day. So not only do you have a source of news, or the source of news that most people get their information from, that has very little substance to it, it can have misleading substance to it. It can have very opinionated substance to it. And the end result is that people know less than when they even started.
Yeah.
In fact, studies have shown that people who get their information from, say, Fox News are actually more poorly informed than people who don't have any news source at all.
Well, so, and the formula, I mean, if it bleeds, it leads formula. The way I understand the functioning of the human brain is we have our neocortex, our prefrontal cortex, which is the most defining feature of the human brain. And
that's what separates us more than anything else from, say, other organisms.
Yeah, and our ability to have cognitive dissonance is unique to our prefrontal cortex in that you don't see things as black and white, us versus them. That happens in our neocortex. If you are talking about what's going to keep a viewer attached to a program and tuned in, you don't want to deal with the things usually that deal with the prefrontal cortex. You want to deal with the neocortex, or the cerebral cortex, or the amygdala, which is the fight or flight response, which is the fear response.
That's
which is
midbrain activity.
Yeah, which somebody's bleeding, and then your reptile brain takes over, or Trump said this today, and then all of a sudden you're activated, your fear centers and your anger and your black and white view of the world is activated. And then we are all either in the camp of liberal, we hate Trump, he sucks, he's terrible, he's doing everything wrong, or we're conservative, we hate the media, we hate the way they're portraying Trump, Trump's the best. And it's just creating this discourse which is not useful at all.
Well, that kind of level of information feeds what has been referred to as our EQ, our emotional quotient, as opposed to our IQ, which is our intelligent quotient.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. And so the more we rely on that kind of journalism, if you want to call it journalism, and that kind of source of information, the more we remain relegated to that level of functioning and that level of inadequate information and frequently disinformation.
Yeah, and the more we're basically promoting the muddying of the waters of the public discourse. It's like, I think any two people on either end of the spectrum can agree with each other on a lot of points if they just sat down and had a conversation. But if you just want to have a 5-minute news segment and have two people yelling at each other, then let's talk about foreign policy and what Trump's doing, or let's talk about border and what Trump's doing. And it's just, I just see everybody's really getting more and more pissed off right now. And I mean, thankfully, a lot of people are cutting the cord and they're just tuning out. I mean, I just rarely watch the news anymore. I don't see it serving as any meaningful function in my daily life anymore.
Well, full disclosure here, someone who is as concerned as they are with environmental protection and the public health consequences pretty much has to be a political liberal, because the Republicans have basically divorced themselves from any concern about that many years ago and are getting further and further away from that now, especially under the Trump administration. But having said that, when I watch MSNBC, they're guilty of the same, in many cases, the same sort of orientation towards information that will jack up your EQ and not your IQ. Mm-hmm. They are certainly guilty of some of the same sorts of journalistic sins, if you will, of jacking up controversy where what really is needed is simply information and facts.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think you could make that kind of critique on both ends of the cable spectrum, from Fox News to MSNBC. Now, I don't think Fox News is comparable to MSNBC in terms of being willing to really distort the situation. They are in a category all by themselves. But my point being is that there are fewer and fewer sources of information for your IQ instead of your EQ.
Yeah. Yeah, and the problem is that the advertisers and the way the media environment is set up is they want to put people in boxes and camps. And a program
Controversy
that comes out,
makes money.
Exactly. And if you're saying, okay, who's your audience? You can say, oh, well, we're a conservative news program, and we're appealing to the Trump supporters, and we're appealing to the right wing of the party, or we're left wing and we're liberal, because you can sell ads that way. You can put a box around everybody. And then what we found out about Facebook is that they create these things called filter bubbles. They try to find out, okay, is this person liking more left-wing and liberal stuff, or are they liking more conservative stuff? If they're liking left-wing stuff, then they feed you more of that information, so you'll produce more likes of the content they're feeding you. So it puts everybody in sort of a bubble, so that they're not hearing the opposing points of view. And it's not like they want to try to improve civil discourse. They want you to press that like button, because then you're going to...
And what is the common denominator of so many of these kinds of things that we just described we really hate? And that is companies are trying to monetize everything you do. Mm-hmm. They want to monetize every thought you have, all your preferences. They want to monetize your connection with your friends. They want to monetize things that should not be monetized.
Yeah.
And of course, if we want to come full circle, that's harkens back to so many of our pollution battles, where somebody wants to monetize for their own benefit the airshed along the Wasatch Front, our water quality. Somebody wants to take special advantage of an asset that belongs to all of us. They basically want to claim it for themselves.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, and I think if we as a general public don't begin to stand up for our own health and well-being, our ability to breathe our air, our ability to have and enjoy this beautiful environment we live in here, if we don't start doing something and standing up for, in opposition against things like the inland port, in opposition to allowing these industrial polluters to continue, obviously, I guess your message is things are just going to get worse, right?
Well, I just wrote a book called Death by Corporation: Killing Humankind in the Age of Monster Corporations. And there are about 19 chapters in it where I review the business practices of major international corporations and entire industries. And it is shocking how much they disregard human life in their business practices. They are literally knowingly willing to kill people by the thousands, hundreds of thousands, in some cases millions, and in a few cases billions, to make money. The pharmaceutical industry, obviously the fossil fuel industry, some of our car companies, the petrochemical industry, big agriculture, gun manufacturers. You can just go on and on down the list of major industries and major corporations and examine their business practices, and they are literally willing to sacrifice the lives of people knowingly to make more money.
Yeah.
And in the case of some of these businesses, it's human lives on the order of millions and billions that they're willing to sacrifice.
I have a brother who's a doctor, and we were talking about this. The way the food guide pyramid is still set up, that we should be eating tons of carbs and tons of grains, and they know, I mean, the majority of Americans, I think, who are informed know that you would never do that. But still, they keep the food guide pyramid the way it is. And if there's no better telling sign that our government agencies are not looking out for our best interests in health and wellness,
Well,
I think it's the food guide pyramid.
That book that I just told you about ended up to be longer than what most people read. Again, they don't have the attention span to read a long book, but it ended up to be long enough I couldn't include every single industry. But one of the industries I didn't include is the sugar industry. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the history of how dietary guidelines were issued to the public, the sugar industry had a significant impact on steering the public towards an obsession with avoiding cholesterol and fat for decades. And now, obviously, there's been so much emerged in terms of medical and nutritional science in the last 6 to 7 years that we know, in fact, that carbohydrates, sugar in particular, mm-hmm. is probably much worse for us than foods that we considered, quote, too fatty.
Yeah.
But in the history of how the sugar industry muscled their way into dietary guidelines for the American public, sanctioned by the government, is another shocking example of businesses and industry knowingly willing to sacrifice the lives of people for money.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't know that about the sugar industry. I knew that big ag and grain producers, they've developed grain to the point where it's the wheat berries are so huge, and they've developed dwarf grain so that it's super short, that it doesn't even resemble what the natural grain used to look like. And then when they harvest it, the grains are so big and fat that the alteration to the grain is been so dramatically changed just in the past few decades that there's really very little to say that the human body has been able to adapt quick enough to digest that flour that is being produced on a massive scale. So I read a book called Wheat Belly, because I noticed how many men suffer from this pregnant belly, and they walk around and
the classic beer gut.
Yeah, and I found out, I started getting that in my 40s, and I was like, dang, what's going on? And as you said, I found out it was inflammation was the biggest cause, but then just eating way too much sugar and carbohydrates. And when I cut that out, it was like I could run farther and faster. I started doing more trail running, and I can now run 6 to 7 miles without a problem. But this is not readily available, this information. It's just not.
Well, that could segue into a very fascinating discussion about the appropriateness of an American diet that is heavily dependent on genetically modified organisms, GMOs.
Yeah.
And, that may be time for another complete discussion in and of itself. But a lot of companies want you to think that if you're opposed to GMOs, then you're as much of a scientific Luddite as someone who denies the climate crisis. But the two aren't comparable at all.
No.
And I personally believe that GMOs play a significant role in what is now an epidemic of inflammatory bowel disease. We're now seeing it in adolescents and in children, mm-hmm. where we never used to see that at all. And not only is it can be a debilitating disease, inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's disease, but it also is all too often a prelude to eventual bowel cancer, rectal cancer, and things like that. Mm-hmm. But GMOs, the only real success that the biotech industry has achieved in terms of GMOs is finding ways to either embed within the plant itself a pesticide or create a plant that is resistant to an externally sprayed pesticide, Roundup Ready grains.
Yeah.
That can be drenched multiple times during the year with a very toxic pesticide, Roundup, mm-hmm. and survive it, so that they can get rid of the weeds.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, now they've even gone to what's called desiccation of the grain towards the end of the harvest season that dries it out. So they give it one last application of Roundup. Roundup is a biological poison.
Yeah.
As an herbicide,
there's a
it
big
is
lawsuit out.
des-
And you can see billboards
well, I hope
where you're
you've
exposed to Roundup. Called to
absolutely
be part of the class action lawsuit.
But the consequences of Roundup are far beyond just causing some people to get lymphomas. But at any rate, so now most big ag produced grains that are ultimately fed to cattle, by the way, but most of these big ag production processes involved one last final spraying with Roundup just before harvest. So when that grain gets scooped up and eventually makes it to your basic bakery and is baked into bread, it's kind of its last frosting on that cake is a nice big dose of Roundup.
Yeah, it's terrible.
And Roundup is simply a biologic poison.
And then our same, USDA and FDA, who are so careful about protecting us from supposedly every kind of harm that's out there.
Actually, they're not very good at that. But anyway, go on with your thought.
They're making it so difficult for local producers to get their products into stores. They're making it difficult for a small dairy farm to get their raw milk into the hands of consumers. They're protecting us from those local people. They are at the same time saying there's nothing wrong with GMO. We're not going to allow a GMO, non-GMO label. We have to go to a third-party source to get a non-GMO label. And I just think it's about time people started just realizing the harm that's out there.
Well, I think there's a real scientific flaw in the whole idea of GMOs, that you can insert a particular for example, Roundup resistant gene in a plant and expect everything else to be the same. Well, that's not how genes work. Genes work in a community of other genes. You can't just pluck one gene out and expect the end result to be the same, like one brick in a wall. They're all related to each other. They're in close proximity to each other. They sit in the same sort of chemical bath. What happens to one gene can turn an adjacent gene on or off. So the idea that you can mess around with these genes and come up with something that's still safe, that in and of itself is inherently flawed. But probably the worst part about GMOs is that they are basically a new delivery system for more pesticides.
Yeah.
Pesticides, whether they're insecticides or herbicides, and those are the two categories of pesticides. In either case, they are biologic poisons. Mm-hmm. And it's no surprise that they can have a detrimental effect on human cells and human health, just like they can to insects and to other plants, like in this case, weeds. So,
and how they can ruin our topsoil.
It seems like
as
in
well.
the last 10 to 15 years, we are completely unlearning the lesson we should have learned from Rachel Carson's Silent Spring back in the 1960s.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's useful information. I hope most more people take that and use it, because it's I think it's a somewhat the world is becoming a little bit more poisonous and dangerous, and if we can't trust that our government's going to be looking out for us. We have to just know what to look out for ourselves, and I'd say empower your own knowledge base so that you can know how to live in the 21st century.
Well, here's one little nugget that might be useful that touches on many of the topics that we've talked about today. We now know that probably 80 to 90% of cancer is environmentally caused. Now, included in environmental exposures are things like smoking. That's your own personal environment that you're polluting. It includes contaminants in what you eat and what you drink. But you have environmental causes and exposures, and then the only other main category is genetic. It turns out that genetics is a very small portion of your overall cancer risk. So most of it is environmental exposures. And how do those environmental exposures happen? They happen because some business has decided that they can do that. And as long as the public is basically unaware or apathetic, they can continue to get away with it. Well, people need to not be apathetic. They need to not be ignorant about it. They need to learn about the exposures that they are subjecting themselves to and that other people are subjecting them to, and that other big and small companies are subjecting them to, so they can defend their own health.
Yeah.
And so many of the things we've talked about today fall into that example.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I didn't know that cancer was mostly caused by environmental factors.
When you include things like a lot of the contaminants and chemicals that you eat as an environmental exposure, and it is, and you're polluting your own environment when you're doing your own smoking and that kind of stuff. If you include that in the environmental category, and so that leaves you with the other category being genetic, most of our risk is environmental. The overwhelming majority of it is environmental.
Yeah. Well, I hope people take action based on this podcast and do something about this.
Well,
what kind of doctor are you, by the way?
I'm an anesthesiologist.
Oh, okay.
Did a fellowship training in intensive care medicine as well, but I practice as an anesthesiologist.
Cool. That's what my brother is.
Oh, really?
He's an anesthesiologist in Reno, yeah.
I put people to sleep and hopefully wake them up.
Yeah.
And study their brain while they're asleep and all that other kind of stuff.
Well, I really appreciate what you do. I follow you, and I read your op-eds in the Tribune and Deseret News, and I really appreciate you getting the word out and helping inform the public about what's going on, because the more I like to think that I'm a more optimistic person, but the more I get into these issues like air quality, like GMO, like all these environmental factors that affect our quality of life and our health and well-being, it's just a pretty grim picture that's being presented out there. And I think that the only thing that can really make a difference is informing people. So, yeah, I really appreciate you coming on.
Well, I'm glad to do it. We're going to keep hammering away till enough people listen, including the people who really pull the levers of power in the state of Utah.
Yeah, let's hope that happens.
Yeah.
Tell me the name of your book again and where people can find it.
It's called Death by Corporation, The Killing of Humankind in the Age of Monster Corporations. And I'm embarrassed to say you can get it on Amazon because I'm not a big fan of Amazon, but that's where you can get it, and I encourage them to read it. It's not a pleasant read. I've had to actually sprinkle as much humor as I can throughout the book so that people don't get so depressed they don't want to continue reading it. But it's an awful lot of very important information that has an impact on people's everyday lives.
Great. I'll pick it up and read it. That sounds good.
Great.
Yeah, well, thanks for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us on the Utah Stories Show. If you'd like to be a bigger part of the program, go visit utahstories.com and subscribe to our newsletter. Another way you can be a part of it is you can join us on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. Those are our 3 social media platforms. We're way more actively involved in YouTube and Instagram than we are any other platforms. And just so you know a little bit about this program, we're into preserving the quality of life we enjoy here in Utah. That pretty much encompasses all of our guests on the program. If that's something you're into as well, then I hope you join us and recommend guests, recommend topics, come with your questions. We're live streaming our episodes every Tuesday at 1:30 on YouTube, so you can join us live. And thanks for being a part of the program. Until next time, this is Richard Markosian signing out.